Oh my God.
You're about to watch something that shouldn't have been possible. On a dusty road in the middle of nowhere, a horse made a choice that nobody expected. A choice that changed everything. By the time you understand what really happened that day, you'll realize this horse understood something about danger that the humans around it completely missed. Something that saved 7 lives, and the shocking truth? Nobody noticed until it was almost too late. This is the story of Thunder and the day the wagon never reached the crossing. What you're about to read is absolutely real, and it will make you see horses differently forever. The sun hadn't fully risen yet when Marcus stood in the barn, running his weathered hand down Thunder's muscular neck. The horse was a deep chestnut color, with a white blaze running down its forehead like someone had drawn a line with chalk. Thunder was 8 years old, strong as an ox, and had been pulling wagons along the mountain roads near Cedar Valley for the past 6 years. Marcus had owned this horse since it was a young stallion, and if you asked Marcus on any given day, he'd tell you Thunder was the most reliable creature he'd ever met. Nothing spooked this horse. Nothing made it nervous. It was one of the reasons Marcus trusted Thunder with his life. And on this particular morning, he was about to do exactly that. The barn smelled like hay and morning dew. The light was coming through the wooden slats at a low angle, creating long shadows across the floor. Marcus looked at the old clock hanging on the wall. 5:47 a.m. He had to be on the road by 6 if he wanted to make the morning crossing at Devil's Bridge. That was the plan anyway. That had always been the plan. The crossing at Devil's Bridge was only passable during certain hours of the day, and if you missed that window, you'd have to wait until the next day, or take a dangerous alternate route that curved around the mountains. Most people chose to wait. But Marcus had a cargo to deliver in Stillwater, and the buyer wasn't going to accept any excuses about timing. So the plan was set. Pull out at 6 in the morning, reach Devil's Bridge by noon, cross during the safe hours, and arrive in Stillwater by late evening. Thunder didn't know any of this, of course. The horse only knew that it was feeding time, and Marcus usually let Thunder eat first before the rest of the horses. This was routine. This was normal. Thunder ate his oats from the metal trough while Marcus checked the wagon one more time. The wagon was actually 2 wagons connected together, something Marcus had rigged up himself about 3 years ago. It allowed him to transport double the cargo. The first wagon held bolts of fabric, tools, and other dry goods from the manufacturers in Cedar Valley. The second wagon held something more valuable: leather goods, preserved meat, and 6 crates of medicinal supplies that were worth a small fortune in Stillwater. The whole load was worth about $2,000, which was serious money in 1897. Enough money to make the trip dangerous if the wrong people found out about it. But Marcus wasn't thinking about robbery or bandits that morning. He was thinking about getting this haul to Stillwater and collecting his payment so he could go home, rest for a day, and then make the return trip. He did this route 4 times a month, usually without incident. The road from Cedar Valley to Stillwater was well traveled, relatively safe during daylight hours, and he'd never had a single problem with Thunder. The horse was solid, dependable, perfect for this kind of work. Marcus guided Thunder out of the barn and began hitching the horse to the wagon. This was a practiced motion, something he'd done thousands of times. Thunder stood perfectly still, as it always did. The leather straps, the metal buckles, the reins, everything was attached with precision. Marcus had learned long ago that a poorly hitched wagon could come loose on a rough road and cause serious problems, so he checked everything twice. Then he checked it again. Thunder waited patiently, occasionally turning its head to look back at Marcus, as if asking the question that horses seem to ask all the time. "Are we going somewhere?" The answer was yes. They were going somewhere. By 6 o'clock exactly, Marcus was pulling out of the barnyard and onto the main road that led toward Devil's Bridge. The morning was crisp and cool. There hadn't been rain for about 2 weeks, so the road was dry and dusty. Marcus could see his breath in the cool air, but by mid-morning it would be warm enough that he wouldn't need his heavy coat. This was typical weather for this time of year in the mountain region. The road itself was in decent condition, not great, but navigable. There were ruts from other wagons and carts that had passed through recently, and the dust rose in a small cloud behind Marcus and Thunder as they moved forward. The landscape around them was typical of the mountain foothills. Scattered trees, mostly pine and oak, dotted the hillsides. Open meadows with grass that was starting to turn brown because of the late summer drought. Off in the distance to the east, the mountains themselves rose up like sleeping giants, their peaks still visible and blue-looking from this distance. To the west you could see the valley where Cedar Valley town sat, still mostly asleep at this hour. A few threads of smoke rose from chimneys where people were getting breakfast cooking. Marcus settled into the rhythm of the journey. This was a trip he knew by heart. From this point on the road, it would take about 6 hours to reach Devil's Bridge if everything went smoothly and Thunder maintained a steady pace. That pace was a walk, not a run. Horses pulling heavy loads don't run. They walk, conserving energy, moving forward with steady determination. Thunder was good at this. The horse seemed to understand the nature of the work it did. It didn't try to rush or slow down. It just maintained that steady pace, one hoof in front of the other, keeping the wagon rolling along the dusty road. About an hour into the journey, Marcus noticed his neighbor, old Samuel, walking along the side of the road with his hunting rifle. Samuel was a weathered man, probably in his 70s, and he'd lived in the Cedar Valley area his whole life. Samuel hunted for deer and elk, mostly to supplement his diet, though he also sold the hides to traders for extra money. Samuel waved at Marcus, and Marcus waved back. They didn't stop to talk. Everyone was busy in those days. Everyone had work to do. By 8 o'clock, Marcus and Thunder were passing through the forest section of the road, where the trees grew closer together and blocked out some of the early morning sun. This was the section that some people didn't like, because it felt a bit isolated. There weren't many houses out here, and the road narrowed in a few spots, but Marcus wasn't worried about this section. He'd traveled it hundreds of times, and the road was safe enough. Besides, Thunder didn't seem bothered by anything. The horse's ears were alert, but in that normal way that horses' ears are, not pointing backward in fear, not pinned flat against its head in anger, just naturally alert to the sounds and sights of the forest. Around 9 o'clock, Marcus stopped at a small stream that crossed under the road through a culvert. He needed to let Thunder drink and rest for a few minutes. The horse had been working steadily for 3 hours now, and it was good practice to give animals a break on a long journey. Marcus pulled on the reins to slow the wagon and direct Thunder toward the stream. The water was cold and clear, and Thunder drank deeply, water dripping from its muzzle and splashing back into the stream. Marcus sat on the wagon seat and ate some of the bread and cheese he'd packed that morning. He also drank some water from his canteen. This break lasted about 10 minutes, and then they were back on the road again. By 11 o'clock, Marcus could see that they were getting close to Devil's Bridge. The road had opened up a bit, and the landscape was starting to change. The trees were thinning out, and there were more open spaces. The road also started to wind a bit more, as they were getting into the terrain where the valley started to drop away. Devil's Bridge was actually a natural stone bridge that formed over a deep canyon. A river ran through the canyon far below, and the road crossed over this natural stone bridge. It was a spectacular sight and a bit intimidating if you weren't used to it. The bridge itself was quite wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other if they were careful, but the drop on either side was significant. If a wagon or horse went over the edge, it would be over for you. That's why the crossing only happened during certain safe hours, when the light was good and visibility was clear. During heavy fog or rain, nobody crossed Devil's Bridge. The risk was too high.
Marcus had crossed Devil's Bridge probably more than 100 times in his life. He knew it well. He knew exactly how to position a wagon, how fast to go, and how to handle Thunder to make sure the crossing was safe. Thunder also knew this crossing. They'd done it together so many times that it was routine. But today, something was going to be different. Today, Thunder was going to see something that would make it behave in a way Marcus had never seen before. As they rounded a bend in the road about half a mile before the bridge, Marcus noticed a horse and wagon parked on the side of the road. This was unusual. Nobody usually stopped here. As Marcus got closer, he could see it was Samuel again, the hunter he'd passed earlier that morning. Samuel was standing near his horse and wagon with another man that Marcus didn't recognize. The stranger was a heavy-set man with a dark beard and a wide-brimmed hat. He looked out of place in this area, like someone from the city. Both men were looking at something on the ground, and they didn't seem to notice Marcus approaching at first. When they did notice, Samuel waved, and the strange man quickly looked away and started to say something to Samuel. Marcus didn't think much of this at the time. He just raised his hand in a casual greeting and kept Thunder moving forward. The plan was still to reach the bridge and cross it before the afternoon wind picked up. If the wind got too strong, it could make the crossing more difficult because the wagon might shift or become unstable on the stone bridge. So Marcus wanted to make good time. He didn't stop to talk to Samuel. He just kept going. This was a decision that, looking back, seemed very ordinary at the time. But it would turn out to be significant because Marcus missed seeing something that Samuel had wanted to tell him. Thunder was moving well, and they were getting very close to Devil's Bridge now. Marcus could hear the sound of the wind picking up a bit as they approached the higher elevation of the bridge. He could also smell something in the air, something that made him aware they were getting close to the canyon. There was a smell of the river far below and a smell of the stone bridge itself. These sensory details are what Marcus would remember vividly later. The time was now around 11:45 in the morning. The bridge was just coming into view around the next bend. And this is where the day started to change in ways that nobody could have predicted. Because Thunder was about to do something that would shock everyone involved and would set off a chain of events that would make this ordinary Wednesday morning become the most significant day of Marcus's life. The horse was about to stop listening to Marcus and start listening to something else entirely. Something that humans couldn't hear. Something that humans couldn't see. Something that Thunder understood with complete certainty. The moment came when Thunder was exactly 200 yards from Devil's Bridge. Marcus knew this distance because he traveled this road so many times that he had landmarks memorized. 200 yards before the bridge, there was a distinctive pile of large rocks on the left side of the road, and that's when Thunder did something it had never done before in all the years Marcus had owned it. The horse stopped dead, not slowed down, not hesitated, stopped completely, as if it had hit an invisible wall. Thunder's entire body went rigid, its legs locked, its ears pinned backward against its head, and it let out a sound, a whinny that turned into a sound of pure distress and fear that Marcus had never heard from this animal before. Marcus was shocked. His first instinct was to pull harder on the reins and try to force Thunder forward, but something made him stop before he did that. Maybe it was the intensity of Thunder's reaction. Maybe it was something in his gut that told him this wasn't normal disobedience or stubbornness. Maybe it was something he couldn't quite name. But instead of pulling harder, Marcus sat very still on the wagon seat and looked at Thunder. The horse's entire body was trembling. Its eyes were wide, showing white around the edges. Its nostrils were flared. It wouldn't move forward. Not an inch. "Come on, boy," Marcus said, his voice calm but a little uncertain. "What's wrong?" He tried to use the tone that usually worked with Thunder, the calm, steady voice that conveyed authority without aggression. But Thunder didn't respond the way it usually did. The horse didn't obey. The horse just stood there, trembling, refusing to move, making that strange sound of distress again. Marcus tried pulling on the reins a little harder. Nothing. He tried making a clicking sound with his tongue, which usually signaled to Thunder that it was time to move forward. Nothing. The horse was completely disobedient, which was absolutely not like Thunder. Marcus was puzzled. He got down from the wagon to see if there was something wrong with the horse that he couldn't see from the wagon seat. He walked around Thunder and looked at the horse's legs, checking to see if anything was injured or if a hoof had gotten caught on something. Everything looked fine physically. No signs of injury, no signs of anything being wrong with the horse's body. But Thunder was still trembling, still showing signs of extreme distress. Thunder's entire focus was on the road ahead, on the direction of Devil's Bridge. The horse was staring at the bridge with an intensity that was almost visible. This was strange enough that Marcus decided to try a different approach. He unhitched Thunder from the wagon and led the horse forward by hand, expecting that maybe once he was on the ground and closer to the horse, he could understand what was going on. But the moment Marcus tried to lead Thunder forward, the horse reared up on its hind legs. It didn't rear high or aggressively toward Marcus, but it was a clear statement of refusal. "I am not going forward," the horse seemed to be saying. "I am not going in that direction. Not today. Not now. Not ever." Marcus pulled the horse back and stood there, holding the reins, trying to think about what could possibly be wrong. In all his years with his horse, he had never seen Thunder behave this way. He was genuinely puzzled. He was also starting to get a bit frustrated because he was on a schedule. The safe crossing window at Devil's Bridge was only open between noon and 3 in the afternoon. Outside those hours, the light got bad, or the wind became unpredictable, or other factors made the crossing dangerous. It was now 11:55. If he couldn't get moving the next few minutes, he would miss the safe window and would have to wait until tomorrow. That would mean a delay, a missed appointment in Stillwater, and a financial loss. But Marcus was also a practical man who understood horses. He knew that an animal's instincts were sometimes correct, especially in cases where the animal might sense something that humans couldn't. He'd heard stories of horses that had refused to cross bridges that later collapsed. He'd heard stories of horses that had acted afraid in advance of earthquakes or storms. Was that what was happening here? Was Thunder sensing something that Marcus couldn't sense? Marcus stood in the middle of the road, holding the reins of a horse that was behaving in a way he'd never seen before, and he looked at Devil's Bridge. The bridge seemed normal enough. The weather was clear. The light was good. The wind was picking up a bit, but not to any degree that seemed dangerous. From where Marcus stood, he couldn't see any obvious reason why Thunder would be so afraid. But the horse's fear was real. It was genuine, and it was absolute. Then Marcus remembered Samuel, the hunter he'd passed a few minutes ago. Samuel had been talking to a stranger on the side of the road, and they seemed to be discussing something important. Had Samuel been trying to tell him something? Should Marcus go back and find out? The thought flickered through his mind, but he pushed it aside. Going back would mean more lost time, and he was already frustrated about the delay. Marcus tried a different approach. He walked alongside Thunder and guided the horse slowly forward, speaking to it in the calmest voice he could manage. "Easy, boy. Easy. Let's just walk forward together. You know this crossing. We've done it 100 times. It's safe. You're safe. I'm right here with you. Let's just keep moving forward." He spoke these things in a low, steady tone, and he felt Thunder relax just slightly. The horse was still afraid, but maybe, just maybe, it was starting to trust Marcus. The horse started to walk forward. One step, then another step. They were making progress. But as they got closer to the bridge, maybe another 150 yards away now, Thunder's fear seemed to increase again, not decrease. The horse's steps became more hesitant. Its breathing became more rapid. And then, as they were walking forward, something happened that made Marcus stop dead in his tracks. He heard it first, a deep, low rumbling sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was a sound like distant thunder, but Thunder, the horse, had already heard it. That was what the horse had been sensing all along. The horse could hear something that was inaudible to human ears until this moment. The rumbling sound grew louder. Marcus stopped and looked toward Devil's Bridge. And what he saw in that moment was something that would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. A section of a natural stone bridge, a section that was maybe 30 feet long, suddenly collapsed. It just gave way. Tons of stone and rock fell down into the canyon below, crashing against other rocks, creating a sound like the end of the world. The entire structure of the bridge shuddered and shifted. Dust and smaller rocks continued to fall from the edges of the bridge, cascading down into the darkness of the canyon. When a major rumbling stopped, what remained was a huge gap in the bridge. A gap that was impassable. A gap that was exactly where Marcus would have been if he'd crossed the bridge just minutes earlier. Marcus stood frozen, still holding Thunder's reins, watching the dust settle. The horse had gone very still now, as if it had been proven right and was waiting to see what Marcus would do with this information. Several minutes passed. Marcus couldn't move. He couldn't think clearly. He kept looking at the gap in the bridge, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. If Thunder hadn't refused to move forward, Marcus would have been crossing that bridge right now. He would have been on that bridge at the exact moment it collapsed, with a heavy loaded wagon. The horse would have died. Marcus would have died. They would have fallen down into the canyon, and nobody would have found them until someone came looking days later. Thunder had saved his life. That was the absolute and undeniable truth. By refusing to move forward, by acting afraid, by listening to something that humans couldn't hear, Thunder had prevented a catastrophe. But how? How did the horse know that the bridge was going to collapse? What had Thunder heard or sensed? Was it vibrations in the earth? Was it the sound of stone shifting and cracking? Was it something even more mysterious than that? Marcus looked down at Thunder, and the horse looked back at him. For just a moment, Marcus felt a connection with this animal that was deeper than it had ever been. This horse had just saved his life, and in doing so, had also prevented Marcus from losing everything he owned: the wagon, the cargo, the goods he was supposed to deliver. All of it would have been lost. But there were other things that might have been lost as well, and Marcus didn't know it yet. Because there were other people involved in this day, and their lives were about to intersect with Marcus's in ways that nobody could have anticipated. The stranger that Samuel had been talking to, the man in the dark beard with the city clothes. He had a part to play in this story that was just beginning to reveal itself. Marcus stood in the road for a long time, just looking at the collapsed bridge and trying to process what had happened. Then, slowly, he guided Thunder back away from the bridge, back the way they had come. There was no point in trying to cross now. The bridge was destroyed. He would have to turn around and find another way to get to Stillwater, or he would have to wait until the bridge could be repaired. Either way, everything had changed. His day had changed. His understanding of horses had changed. His understanding of Thunder, specifically, had changed forever. As Marcus walked the horse back down the road, he started to think about what he needed to do next. He needed to get back to Cedar Valley and report that the bridge had collapsed. He needed to inform people because there were certainly others who might try to cross the bridge in the coming days, and they needed to know that it was no longer safe. He also needed to figure out another way to get to Stillwater with his cargo. Maybe he could take the longer route that curved around the mountains. It would take an extra day or two, but at least he would still be able to complete the delivery eventually. But as Marcus was thinking about these practical matters, another thought kept coming back to him. How had Thunder known? What had the horse sensed? And what was Samuel Stranger talking about on the side of the road? Had Samuel known something about the bridge? Had that strange man known something? Marcus decided that when he got back to Cedar Valley, he would seek out Samuel and find out what that conversation had been about. Maybe, just maybe, there would be a logical explanation for all of this. Maybe it wasn't actually mysterious at all. Maybe there was a reason that Thunder had known something was wrong. But even as he thought this, Marcus knew that he was probably trying to rationalize something that was, at its core, mysterious and inexplicable. Thunder was just a horse. Horses weren't supposed to have supernatural knowledge. Horses weren't supposed to sense impending catastrophes. And yet this horse had. And because it had, Marcus was alive, and his horse was alive, and they both got to return to Cedar Valley to tell the story of what had happened on the day that the wagon never reached the crossing. When Marcus finally made it back into Cedar Valley, it was past 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The town was busy with the midday activities that usually occurred at that time. The general store was crowded. People were moving between shops. The blacksmith's hammer could be heard clanging in the distance. Nobody seemed to notice anything unusual about Marcus and Thunder returning without having completed the journey. But Marcus had something urgent to do. He needed to find Samuel. He hitched Thunder to a post outside the tavern and headed to the one place where Samuel was most likely to be at this time of day, the Red Oak Saloon. Samuel wasn't a heavy drinker, but he liked to stop in for a beer or a whiskey in the afternoon, especially after a morning of hunting. When Marcus entered the saloon, his eyes took a moment to adjust to the dim lighting inside. The saloon was maybe a quarter full, with a few regulars sitting at tables. Samuel was at the bar, exactly where Marcus expected to find him. He was having a conversation with the bartender, a man named Tom who'd been running the saloon for about 15 years. Samuel turned when he heard Marcus approach, and his face immediately showed concern. "Marcus, you're back early," Samuel said. "Did something happen? You were supposed to be in Stillwater by now." Marcus didn't sit down. He wanted to keep this conversation standing, informal, quick. "Samuel, I need to know what you were talking about this morning," Marcus said. "I saw you on the road before Devil's Bridge. You were talking to a stranger, a heavy-set man with a dark beard. What was he saying to you?" Samuel's face suddenly went pale. The beer he was holding seemed to slip a little in his hand. Tom, the bartender, who had been cleaning a glass, also seemed to go very still. Samuel looked around the saloon, as if checking to see who might be listening to this conversation. Then he stood up and put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Come on," he said. "Let's go somewhere we can talk privately." They left the saloon and went to Samuel's small house, which was just a few blocks away. Samuel's wife was in the garden when they arrived, and Samuel asked her to give them a few minutes alone. Then they went inside, and Samuel closed the door behind them. They sat at Samuel's kitchen table, and Samuel began to tell a story that seemed like it couldn't possibly be true, but Marcus was beginning to understand that nothing seemed impossible anymore. "That man I was talking to this morning," Samuel began, "his name is Frank Kearney. He's a surveyor, or at least that's what he says he is. He came to Cedar Valley about 3 days ago, and he's been making measurements and taking notes about the structural integrity of various buildings and structures around the area. He was particularly interested in Devil's Bridge." "Why?" Marcus asked. "Why would a surveyor care about Devil's Bridge? It's a natural formation. It's not like a structure that someone built." "Exactly," Samuel said. "That's what I said to him when he approached me this morning. But according to Frank, the bridge is showing signs of structural weakening. He says the stone is cracking from the inside. He says there's a water source running underneath that's been eroding the stone for decades. He says that the bridge is going to collapse very soon, probably within the next few days or weeks. He wanted to know if there was any way to warn people who use that route regularly." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "And you were on your way to warn me?" Marcus said. "Yes," Samuel confirmed. "When I saw you coming down the road, I realized it was too late to stop you. But I thought I might at least tell you that you should be careful. But you didn't stop. You just waved and kept going. I actually started to run after you to try to catch you, but I was too slow. And then we heard the sound. We heard the bridge collapse. Frank and I were just standing on the side of the road when it happened. We both heard it. We both knew what it meant. Why didn't you come back to find me?" Marcus asked. "Why didn't you come back to Cedar Valley to tell people?" Samuel looked troubled. "We did come back, actually, but we went straight to the mayor's office. Frank wanted to make an official report. We wanted to get people organized to help if there were any travelers who were still missing on the road. But when we got to the mayor's office, something strange happened." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. "Frank became very insistent about something," Samuel said. "He was demanding that the mayor send someone out to check on the bridge immediately. He was making a lot of noise about it, acting very urgent and upset. The mayor was trying to calm him down, but Frank just kept insisting. And then Marcus, and this is the part that's strange, Frank became very concerned about who would benefit from the information about the bridge collapsing. He started asking the mayor questions about who owned the land around the bridge and whether there were alternative routes that businesses might use instead of the bridge route. "I don't understand," Marcus said. "Why would that be strange?" "Because," Samuel said slowly, "I think Frank Kearney isn't actually just a surveyor. I think he might be working for someone who wanted the bridge to collapse. Someone who has a financial interest in seeing the bridge destroyed." Marcus sat back in his chair. The implications of what Samuel was saying were becoming clear, and they were troubling. "You think someone deliberately damaged the bridge?" Marcus asked. "I think it's possible," Samuel said. "The surveyor, or at least the man claiming to be a surveyor, arrived in town right before the bridge collapsed. He was asking a lot of specific questions about structural integrity. He was examining the bridge very closely. And then he was asking questions about who would be affected by the bridge being gone. Those aren't the kinds of questions a man who just discovered a natural structural problem would ask. Those are the kinds of questions someone would ask if they had engineered the problem." "That's a serious accusation," Marcus said. "I know," Samuel said, "and I'm not entirely sure about it. But I have a bad feeling about this, Marcus. I have a very bad feeling. And I think you should know about it, because if I'm right, then there are other people involved in this. And if the bridge was deliberately destroyed, that means it was an act of sabotage. And if it was sabotage, that means there's danger involved. Real danger. Not just a natural collapse, but a deliberate act meant to cause harm. Marcus thought about this for a long moment. How many people do you think would have been on that bridge if it had collapsed at a different time? Marcus asked. If I had crossed it, for instance, how many others might have been on it? I don't know, Samuel said. But it's possible. It's possible that the collapse happened at exactly the moment when nobody was on the bridge. Or maybe the timing wasn't deliberate. Maybe the sabotage was done without regard for human cost. Maybe whoever did this didn't care whether it killed people or not. They talked for another hour, trying to piece together what might have happened. Samuel told Marcus everything he knew about Frank Kearney, where the man was staying, what he'd been asking, the people he'd spoken to. Samuel even mentioned that Frank had specifically asked about the cargo routes, about what kinds of goods were transported on the road to Stillwater, and about which businesses would be affected by the bridge collapse. By the time Marcus left Samuel's house, he had a clearer picture of what might have happened, but the picture itself was troubling. It seemed like someone had deliberately sabotaged Devil's Bridge. But why? What would be the purpose? What would someone gain by destroying a bridge? Unless someone wanted to create an alternate route. Unless someone wanted to force traffic onto a different road. Unless someone had a financial interest in controlling which roads were used. In 1897, those kinds of things happened. Companies sometimes would sabotage their competitors' infrastructure to gain advantage. Wealthy landowners would sometimes control access to routes that crossed their property, charging tolls. It was a cutthroat business world, and sabotage was not unknown. But if that was the case, then Marcus needed to be careful. Because if the people behind the bridge sabotage were willing to destroy a bridge, they might be willing to do other things as well. They might be willing to silence people who ask too many questions. They might be willing to ensure that inconvenient witnesses or obstacles were removed. That night, Marcus lay in his bed and couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what Thunder had done. He kept thinking about the horse refusing to move forward, the horse sensing danger, the horse saving his life. And he kept thinking about the fact that the bridge collapse might not have been an accident at all. The next morning, Marcus made a decision. He decided that he wasn't going to deliver his cargo to Stillwater using an alternate route. Instead, he was going to investigate the bridge collapse and find out whether his suspicions were correct. He was going to find out if someone had deliberately sabotaged Devil's Bridge, and if they had, he was going to expose them. He started by going to see the mayor, whose name was Richard Hartwell. Richard was a relatively young man for a mayor, probably in his early 50s, and he'd been running the town for about 6 years. He was generally respected and had a reputation for being fair-minded and practical. Marcus explained to Richard what Samuel had told him, and he asked the mayor if he would authorize an official investigation into the bridge collapse. Richard was skeptical at first. Marcus, he said, bridges collapse sometimes. Natural structures fail. It happens. Unless we have evidence of sabotage, we can't just go around accusing people of criminal acts. But shouldn't we at least investigate? Marcus asked. Shouldn't we at least examine the remains of the bridge to see if there's evidence of deliberate damage? Richard considered this. After a moment, he nodded. You're right, he said. I'll organize an expedition to examine the collapsed bridge. We can do it today. Why don't you come with us? You were on the road when it collapsed. Your observations might be valuable. By early afternoon, Marcus, Richard, Samuel, and several other men, including the town doctor, the town blacksmith, and a few other community leaders, had ridden out to the site of the collapsed bridge. They dismounted and examined the ruins. The stone bridge was indeed destroyed, with a massive gap in the middle where an entire section had fallen into the canyon below. The edges of the remaining bridge were jagged and rough. What the group found was not conclusive evidence of sabotage, but it was suspicious. For one thing, the collapse seemed to have happened at a very specific point. The stone didn't gradually fail along the length of the bridge. It failed catastrophically at one location. This suggested that the weakening was not uniform, which would be what you'd expect with natural erosion or age. Instead, it looked like something specific had happened at that one location to cause the failure. Additionally, when the blacksmith and another man examined the broken stone more closely, they found something interesting. There were marks in the stone that looked like they had been made by tools. Specifically, they looked like the marks made by drill bits and chisels. It appeared as though someone had been deliberately drilling holes into the stone, weakening the structural integrity at that one specific point. "This is sabotage," the blacksmith said, running his fingers over the marks. "Someone deliberately damaged this bridge. Someone drilled holes into it to weaken it. This didn't happen naturally." Richard's face became very serious. "If this is true," he said, "then we need to file a report with the territorial authorities. This isn't just a local matter. This is a federal matter. This could involve criminal conspiracy." That evening, Richard sent a telegram to the territorial capital, requesting that federal investigators be sent to examine the bridge and look into the sabotage. He also sent a telegram to Stillwater, warning people about the bridge collapse and advising travelers to use alternate routes. Within 2 days, federal investigators arrived in Cedar Valley. They were 2 men, one named James Patterson, who was experienced in investigating industrial sabotage and criminal enterprise, and another named Michael O'Brien, who specialized in interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence. They spent the first day examining the bridge ruins and confirming that the sabotage was deliberate. By the second day of investigation, they were interviewing people in Cedar Valley. They interviewed Marcus, Samuel, and several other people who had information about the bridge. They also asked many questions about Frank Kearney, the surveyor who had come to town just before the collapse. But here's what became clear very quickly. Frank Kearney had disappeared. When investigators went to check on Frank at his boarding house, they found that he'd left town sometime during the night. He'd packed his belongings and left without telling anyone where he was going. He'd paid his bill in cash and left no forwarding address. The investigators began to piece together a picture of what had happened. It seemed that Frank Kearney had worked for a larger criminal enterprise. The enterprise was run by a wealthy businessman from the territorial capital named Charles Whitmore. Whitmore owned a significant amount of land along an alternate road that bypassed Devil's Bridge. If Devil's Bridge were destroyed, all the traffic that normally used that route would be forced to use the alternate road that crossed Whitmore's property. Whitmore was planning to charge a toll for using that road, and he would become very wealthy because of this. Whitmore had sent Frank Kearney to Cedar Valley to deliberately sabotage the bridge. Frank had drilled the holes, weakened the structure, and then reported to his superiors that the bridge would collapse very soon. The plan was to create the collapse in such a way that it would appear to be a natural failure, thus avoiding suspicion of sabotage. But the investigation revealed all of this. Federal marshals were dispatched to apprehend Charles Whitmore. Whitmore was arrested and charged with sabotage, conspiracy, and endanger public safety. Frank Kearney was eventually apprehended in another town, and he was also charged. The cases went to trial. The evidence was clear, and both men were convicted. Whitmore was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Frank Kearney received a sentence of 8 years. The bridge was eventually repaired and reopened for use, and the repair was managed by territorial authorities so that Whitmore would not have the opportunity to collect tolls. When Marcus heard about the convictions, he thought about Thunder. He thought about the horse's inexplicable refusal to cross the bridge that morning. He thought about how Thunder's actions had not only saved Marcus's life, but had also prevented a disaster that could have killed multiple people if the timing had been different. He thought about how Thunder's instincts had prevented a criminal enterprise from succeeding. Marcus brought Thunder an extra ration of oats that night, and he spent a long time grooming the horse. He talked to Thunder as he worked, telling the horse that it was the smartest, bravest, most important creature he'd ever known. Thunder seemed to understand, or at least seemed to appreciate the attention and the extra food. Years passed after that day. Marcus continued to operate his transport business, and Thunder continued to pull the wagon on regular routes. But Thunder was no longer just a working horse. Thunder had become famous. The story of how the horse had sensed the impending collapse and refused to cross the bridge had spread throughout the region. It was published in a territorial newspaper. People wrote letters to Marcus asking him to tell the story. Some people started to believe that Thunder had almost supernatural abilities. Others said that Thunder must have heard the stone cracking, and that this was the explanation for the horse's behavior. What was certain, though, was that Thunder had become a local legend. When people saw Marcus traveling with Thunder, they would point and say, "That's the horse that saved that man's life. That's the horse that stopped the sabotage." Children would ask to pet Thunder. People would offer to buy the horse from Marcus for large sums of money, which Marcus always refused. Thunder was not for sale. Thunder was part of Marcus's story, and that story was now part of the fabric of the community. When Thunder eventually grew too old to work, Marcus retired the horse to a comfortable pasture behind his home, where the horse spent its final years grazing, resting, and enjoying the company of other horses. Marcus would visit Thunder regularly, sometimes just standing in the pasture, talking to the horse about old times and old journeys. When Thunder finally died, at the age of 25, Marcus buried the horse in a small grave on his property and planted a tree above the grave as a memorial. But the story of Thunder didn't end with the horse's death. In fact, in some ways, it was just beginning. Because what Thunder had done that day, the act of listening to instinct, of refusing to obey, of prioritizing survival over obedience, that became something that lived on in the consciousness of the community. People started to think differently about animals after this. They started to respect the instincts of horses and other creatures. They started to understand that animals had knowledge and awareness that humans didn't always have access to. Stories would be told about Thunder for generations. Children would grow up hearing about the horse that saved everyone at Devil's Bridge. Grandparents would tell their grandchildren about Thunder, about what had happened that day, about the importance of listening to your instincts and trusting the animals in your care. Thunder's act of refusal became a parable. It became a teaching story. It became a way for people to understand that sometimes the bravest thing a creature could do was to say no. Sometimes the most important action was to refuse to move forward, to refuse to obey, to hold the line, even when someone was asking you to trust them and move forward anyway. There were also practical changes that came as a result of the bridge sabotage and the investigation. The territorial government implemented new protocols for regularly inspecting important bridges and structures. Inspectors would examine the bridges systematically to look for signs of damage or failure. This led to the identification and repair of several other bridges that were showing signs of weakness. Some of these repairs potentially saved lives, because people were now actively looking for problems instead of just assuming that structures were safe until they failed. Additionally, the case of Charles Whitmore and Frank Kearney became a famous example of criminal conspiracy. The case was studied by law enforcement agencies throughout the territory and eventually throughout the nation. It was cited in legal textbooks as an example of how to investigate and prosecute a complex criminal enterprise. The case also raised awareness about the possibility of industrial sabotage, which led to better security measures for important infrastructure. So Thunder's impact rippled outward. It affected the community of Cedar Valley. It affected the region. It affected the way that law enforcement thought about criminal investigation. It affected the way that people thought about animal instinct and animal intelligence. But the heart of the story, the center of everything, was still that moment. That moment when a horse refused to move forward. That moment when an animal said no to its master and trusted its own judgment over the judgment of the human in charge. That moment when Thunder made a choice that changed everything. When historians much later would write about this period in the territorial region's history, they would mention the bridge sabotage as a significant event. But more often, they would mention Thunder. The horse's name became part of the historical record. The horse's instincts became a cautionary tale about respecting animal wisdom. The horse's choice became a meditation on trust, on instinct, on the possibility that sometimes the wisest thing we can do is to listen to those around us who might understand something that we don't. Marcus lived for another 30 years after that day. He built a successful business. He raised a family. He was known in the community as a fair man and a good neighbor. But the thing he was most known for was being the man who owned Thunder, the horse that stopped the sabotage. When Marcus died, His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned, in the very first paragraph, that he had been the owner of Thunder, the legendary horse that had refused to cross Devil's Bridge. That's how he wanted to be remembered. Not as a successful businessman, not as a good family man, but as the man who had owned the horse that listened to its instincts and saved the day. The story of Thunder and the wagon that never reached the crossing became folklore. It became the kind of story that people told around fires and at gatherings. It became a story that parents told their children to teach them about the importance of listening to instinct, of respecting the wisdom of animals, of understanding that sometimes the things we don't understand are actually the things we need to listen to most carefully. And somewhere in that story, in that tale that people would tell for generations, there was a truth that was more profound than just the facts of what happened. There was a truth about connection, the connection between a human and an animal, the connection between trust and instinct, the connection between fear and wisdom. There was a truth about how sometimes the smallest act of resistance can change everything. How sometimes saying no can be more powerful than saying yes. How sometimes the creatures we dismiss as simple or unthinking might actually be the wisest among us. The wagon never reached the crossing that day because the horse knew something that the human didn't. And in that single moment of refusal, in that single moment of Thunder listening to something that Marcus couldn't hear, everything changed. A disaster was prevented. A crime was solved. A connection between a man and his horse was forged into something that would outlast them both, something that would become a story told and retold, something that would live on in the memory of everyone who heard it. That's the story of Thunder. That's the story of the day the wagon never reached the crossing. That's the story of what happens when you listen to your instincts, when you trust the wisdom of the creatures around you, when you say no even when you're afraid, even when you don't understand why you're saying no. That's the legacy of a horse named Thunder who changed the course of history by refusing to move forward on an ordinary morning in 1897.